Jesus' disciples go back to the scene of the crime in the town where people would have saw him crucified, and now they're proclaiming he's resurrected. Well, why would you go back to the place where people could have actually known what actually happened, especially if you're trying to be disingenuous or dishonest? And then that's where it happens.
I've seen Ricky Gervais on various talk shows. He's one of the world's most famous atheists. And he says, look, there are 3,000 gods if you add them all up from all the religions. Who's to say your one's the real one?
Yeah, well, I think it's a rather foolish argument.
Welcome to the third and final part of my reaction video to Wes Huff's appearance on Piers Morgan's show. If you missed the first two parts, you will find the links in the description below. But don't worry, you don't need to watch those first to follow along here. You can finish this video and circle back to them later. This final episode is especially important because I'll be covering a few key points that, as far as I can tell, very few skeptics are talking about, particularly my response to Wes's claim that the gospel writers wouldn't have made up the story of a woman being the first to witness the resurrection. That section alone is worth sticking around for. So with that, let's dive right in.
I think we have to look at, okay, what explains these 11 scared disciples then going on to not just proclaim that Jesus did rise from the dead, but actually went to the point of risking their lives in persecution. And some of them did die for that proclamation.
This is a common apologetic claim. No one dies for a lie, but we don't actually have solid evidence that the disciples were willing to die specifically for preaching a resurrection. Even if I grant that they were zealous for their faith, claiming they died for this one particular belief is another matter entirely. Think about this. It would sound weird to say they died defending that Jesus fed the 5,000 or raised Lazarus from the dead because we have no idea whether they were ever persecuted for those claims, or if they continued to preach those miracles under threat. In the same way, we don't know if each of these disciples went around proclaiming the resurrection and got into trouble because of it. In fact, for most of the disciples, we don't even have reliable first-century sources detailing where they went or what they did. Their biographies largely show up in the 2nd century or later, and many of them are clearly legendary. And even in those stories, it rarely says they were killed specifically for proclaiming a risen Jesus. According to the Acts of Andrew, Andrew was crucified by the Roman proconsul Agis after converting his wife Maximilia. Why was the proconsul mad? Because after Maximila's conversion, she withdrew from sleeping with her husband, devoting herself to chastity. Agis, enraged by her rejection, had Andrew tortured and executed. Similarly, in the Acts of Philip, Philip converted Nicanora, the wife of the proconsul of Hierapolis. She also rejected further intimacy with her husband, who then ordered Philip to be crucified. These martyrdom legends share a clear theme: apostles preaching to noble women, who, after conversion, refuses intimacy with their husbands, triggering a violent retaliation. But these stories come from 2nd or 3rd century apocryphal texts written long after the apostles' deaths and lack any historical corroboration. More importantly, they never say the apostles were executed for proclaiming that Jesus physically rose from the dead. The cause of persecution is tied to social disruption and sexual abstinence, not to preaching the resurrection. What's also striking is that there are no independent, non-Christian sources from the time that confirm any of these martyrdoms. All the accounts come from within the Christian circles, often long after the fact. For something so often cited as central to Christianity's credibility, the absence of external corroboration is hard to ignore. Apologists often frame it as they died for what they saw, but that assumes we know what they saw. We don't. We don't even know what most of them said. They didn't leave any writing behind for us to read. That's a huge leap, from silence to legend and to certainty. This reminds me of an urban legend from the Columbine High School shooting in 1999. Shortly after the tragedy, a powerful narrative began to spread that the shooters had targeted Christian students. According to the story, they asked girls like Cassie Bernal and Rachel Scott whether they believed in God and shot them when they said yes. Many Christians embraced this account. Cassie's mother even wrote a book called She Said Yes. The stories became a source of inspiration, Christian martyrdom in modern times. But investigations later showed that these events didn't happen the way they were told. For example, witnesses confirmed that no such conversation happened between Cassie and the shooters. A similar exchange may have happened with another student who survived. Still, the martyr stories persisted. Why? There are several possible reasons. First, it gave meaning to a senseless death. Portraying the victim as a martyr gave her death a purpose, something noble and inspiring. Second, it helped people make sense of the event. By framing the shooters as anti-Christian, it fit into a moral narrative. They were evil, influenced by dark forces, and they hated God. Third, though this might not apply to all who repeated the story, some Christian leaders saw it as an opportunity. What kind of faith gives a teenager the strength to face death without denying God? Surely a faith that powerful must be worth investigating, or so the message goes. Cassie's pastor Dave McPherson told the Washington Post, "You will never change the story of Cassie. The church is going to stick to the martyr story. It's the story they heard first and circulated for 6 months uncontested. To the church, Cassie will always say yes. Period." That's a chilling, honest admission. It shows that for many people, what matters most isn't whether the story is true, but whether it's meaningful. Once a powerful narrative takes hold, especially one that reinforces a community's identity and value, truth can become secondary. The emotional impact becomes the anchor, and any later correction, no matter how well supported, feels like an attack rather than a clarification. This is exactly why we need to be careful when evaluating dramatic claims, especially claims tied to faith, sacrifice, and martyrdom. The more inspiring a story is, the more we should pause and ask whether its power is blinding us to the need for evidence. With this in mind, let me ask the question again. Do we actually know Jesus' disciples were killed for proclaiming the resurrection? The answer is no. Can we imagine why the early Christian community might have had a strong incentive to tell those stories anyway? Absolutely. In times of persecution or uncertainty, martyrdom stories serve to validate the community's suffering, inspire loyalty, and reassure believers that they are part of a larger divine plan. They function as a kind of spiritual propaganda, not necessarily malicious, but deeply motivated. A disciple who dies for the truth makes the movement feel more credible. A church built on sacrifice seems stronger than the one built on rumor. These stories offer identity, cohesion, and legitimacy, and once in circulation, they are hard to challenge without looking like you're attacking the faith itself. If you want to see just how scarce the evidence really is, check out my other video, Did Jesus' Disciples Die for Preaching the Resurrection? You might be surprised to find that the sources used as evidence are the very kinds of texts most churches today would dismiss as unreliable. Hello, my friends. This is Shen from Mindful Living. Welcome to the channel, where we explore how to think more clearly and critically so we can make better judgments in all areas of life. If that sounds like something you are interested in, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. In case you are wondering about my background, I used to be a Christian pastor and missionary. I also did some academic work, including teaching biblical Greek and Hebrew, and translating the Hebrew dictionary into Chinese. These days, I no longer identify as a Christian, but I bring that insider perspective into my critiques. My goal isn't to attack people, but to offer thoughtful insights into the issues I see in the Christian faith, especially as it's commonly practiced and proclaimed. Enough about me, let's move on to Wes Huff's next point.
Jesus' disciples go back to the scene of the crime in the town where people would have saw him crucified, and now they're proclaiming he's resurrected. Well, why would you go back to the place where people could have actually known what actually happened, especially if you're trying to be disingenuous or dishonest? And then that's where it happens.
This sounds persuasive at first, but only if you take the narrative in Acts at face value. First, we need to critically examine the source. How reliable is the book of Acts as a historical record? Was it truly the case that the disciples boldly preached in Jerusalem and converted thousands of people? Scholars widely agree that Acts is a theological narrative written decades after the events it describes, with clear editorial motives. It's far from neutral reporting, and the scale of conversions it claims should not be accepted uncritically. Second, even if we were to grant that something like this happened, we have no record of how people outside the Christian group responded. How do we know their claims weren't disputed? The New Testament was written by insiders who had no incentive to preserve opposing voices, only to portray their message as powerful and divinely endorsed. It's a mistake to assume silence from the text means silence in real life. Third, we should remember that Christianity struggled to gain traction in Jerusalem and the broader region of Palestine. According to Acts itself and other historical data, the real growth of the movement happened in the Gentile world. Places like Antioch, Asia Minor, and Rome, not in the city where Jesus was crucified. In fact, Acts 2 even acknowledges that the people who converted at Pentecost were pilgrims and diaspora Jews visiting Jerusalem. That's a crucial detail. It implies that the locals, the people who might have been familiar with Jesus' ministry and death, were not the ones being persuaded. And that makes sense. If anyone had reason to be skeptical, it would have been those who actually lived through the events and could distinguish myth from memory. Christian apologists like Wes Huff argue that the disciples' preaching in Jerusalem strengthens their case because it implies transparency and boldness. But the accounts themselves suggest the opposite. According to Acts, the people who converted were not locals familiar with Jesus' life and death, but visiting pilgrims from other regions. The locals, the ones who would have had first-hand knowledge, largely remained unconvinced. If anything, this weakens the narrative rather than strengthens it.
Stephen is the first martyr. That also happens in Jerusalem. That would have been a warning shot across the bow for the disciples if they wanted to continue on proclaiming these things. They would have realized that this is controversial, both in Jewish circles and in Gentile circles, to be proclaiming these things, to be declaring Jesus as Lord. You know, one of the earliest confessions of Christianity was Jesus is Lord, when the society was saying Caesar is Lord. And so there were risks politically, there were risks religiously, and yet the disciples go on to proclaim these things, even to the detriment of their own lives.
Let's take a closer look at why Wes brings up Stephen. His point seems to be that declaring Jesus is Lord was politically and religiously dangerous, especially in a world where Caesar is Lord was the dominant claim. But that framing doesn't really fit the story of Stephen's death in Acts 6-7. First, the Romans aren't involved at all. Stephen is stoned by a Jewish crowd, not executed by Roman authorities. So the supposed political risk Wes says doesn't apply here. Second, the charges against Stephen aren't about calling Jesus Lord or proclaiming the resurrection of a Jewish rabbi. According to Acts 6:11 and 6:13, he was accused of blasphemy against Moses, God, the law, and the temple. These are internal Jewish disputes, not clashes with Roman imperial ideology. Even if Stephen had called Jesus Lord, we need to consider what that actually means in the context. The title Lord, Greek, Kyrios, is ambiguous. It doesn't necessarily imply divinity. It can simply mean master or sir, depending on the usage. Unlike the Hebrew word Adonai, which was used as a reverent substitute for the divine name of God, the Greek term had a much broader and more flexible range. So saying Jesus is Lord doesn't automatically equate to saying Jesus is God. This is important because it undercuts the idea that such a claim would have sparked outrage on political or theological grounds, especially from Roman authorities. Contrary to what Wes Huff suggests, the Roman Empire actually had no issues with Jews calling their God Lord. Jews had been doing that for centuries, and Rome granted them legal exemptions from emperor worship. The phrase Jesus is Lord only becomes politically charged if it implies disloyalty to Caesar. But again, that wasn't the issue in Stephen's case. His long speech in Acts 7 focuses on criticizing Israel's story of rejecting God's messengers. Even Stephen's final words, I see the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God, chapter 7:56, are not a proclamation of bodily resurrection. They are a vision, a heavenly revelation, not a historical claim open to verification or dispute. What got Stephen killed wasn't about the resurrection or a bold public claim about Jesus' lordship. It was his harsh condemnation of the temple establishment and his challenge to Jewish religious authority. And contrary to Wes Huff's suggestion that Stephen's martyrdom didn't deter the early believers, Acts chapter 8 verse 1 states that the disciples scattered. That's not a scene of fearless defiance. It's a scene of people wisely getting out of harm's way. To be clear, I'm not mocking them for leaving. I would have done the same. But let's be honest, that's a very different picture from the one Wes Huff is trying to portray. The text doesn't show unshakable boldness in the face of danger. It portrays a situation marked by fear, upheaval, and a pragmatic decision to preserve life. Don't just take my word for it. Read the text yourself. And if you come across a verse that clearly says Stephen got stoned for preaching the resurrection, let me know in the comments. I'd love to see it.
I've seen Ricky Gervais on various talk shows. He's one of the world's most famous atheists. And he says, look, there are 3,000 gods if you add them all up from all the religions. Who's to say your one's the real one? And what about the others then? Do they not exist? Are they not real gods? In other words, his position is, look, you can't all be right unless there are 3,000 different versions of a supernatural spiritual being overseeing us all. What do you say to him?
This is a fair question. If you accept miracle claims or religious experiences as evidence for one faith, you have to reckon with the fact that many religions make similar claims. If you say the willingness to suffer or die for a belief makes that belief credible, then why not accept Hinduism or Islam or Mormonism or Zoroastrianism? After all, they have their share of martyrs too. But these religions often contradict one another. If Christianity is true, then reincarnation must be false. If Yahweh is the one true God, then Ahura Mazda from Zoroastrianism can't also be the creator of the universe. They can't all be true at the same time. So the question becomes, what makes Christianity different? And more importantly, are we applying the same standards to other religions that we do to our own? Because if we are willing to say that Muslim martyrs or Hindu miracle stories or Joseph Smith's visions don't count as credible, even if people sincerely believe them, then we have to be consistent and admit that Christian claims don't automatically get a pass either. This is really a question about fairness and consistency. If we reject other religions despite their miracles and martyrs, then those same features can't be used as proof that Christianity is true. You can't have it both ways. And how does Wes respond? He starts with a self-defeating claim that almost seems unreal.
Yeah, well, I think it's a rather foolish argument in that competition doesn't negate objective reality. So say we're using a courtroom analogy. If someone was convicted of a crime here in the city of Toronto where I live, and he stood before a judge and he said, really, you think I committed this crime? Do you know how many people are in the city? We have 3 million people in this city. And you think I'm the one who did the crime? Really? Out of all the, how many people are in Toronto? How many people are in Ontario? How many people are in Canada? How many people are in North America? You really think that given the amount of people that are on this earth, I'm the one who committed the crime? We wouldn't then look at the judge and say, well, that's a good argument. Have you really thought about how many other people are around who, just because this particular individual you think committed the crime, really? Well, no, we don't just arbitrarily, pick someone, or in the case of Christianity, pick a God. We believe that the God of the Bible is the true God based on the evidence of not just what we find in the Bible, but the fine-tuning of the universe, of the morality in the objective reality of this world, and the fact that we are, Piers, people who operate with morals, with meaning and intention, and have intrinsic worth. But we look at these things and we don't arbitrarily pick Yahweh, the God of the Bible, over Zeus and Thor and Allah and Buddha. We do it, I would argue, based on the concrete, publicly available evidence that points to the truth claims that I would argue Christianity answers in regards to the ultimate questions we have.
Wes's analogy might sound clever at first, but when you slow it down, it completely falls apart and actually highlights the problem it's trying to dodge. He says that claiming only one religion is true despite thousands of competitors is like convicting someone of a crime in a city of millions. But this is a self-defeating comparison. In a courtroom, a conviction only happens after a thorough investigation, a careful weighing of specific evidence, and often a jury decision, not just because someone happened to be accused while living in a crowded city. The existence of many other people isn't the issue. What matters is whether there's good reason to believe this person committed the crime. So if Wes wants to apply this analogy to religion, the real question is, has Christianity gone through that kind of rigorous, impartial investigation? Has it been tested alongside other religions with equal scrutiny, using consistent standards of evidence? Or are we just assuming its truth and then calling any supporting arguments evidence? Because here's the thing, every religion offers reasons for belief. Muslims point to Quran's literary beauty, its historical impact, and their own experience of divine guidance. Hindus have philosophical wisdom, ancient traditions, and miracle stories. Mormons claim 11 eyewitness testimonies to the golden plates. If you only investigate one faith generously while dismissing all others without serious consideration, you are not engaged in a courtroom trial. You are preaching to the choir. Wes then lists the usual apologetic grabbag: fine-tuning of the universe, objective morality, meaning, intrinsic worth. But those are philosophical issues, not historical evidence that points specifically to Yahweh, or the resurrection of Jesus, or the authority of the Bible, or the existence of heaven and hell. Plenty of religious and non-religious worldviews offer competing explanations for those same questions. In fact, every one of the things Wes mentions, morality, meaning, intention, can be and has been addressed by other religions. So if that's the standard, it's not clear why Yahweh should rise to the top of the list. And yes, Wes says Christianity didn't pick its God arbitrarily. But let's be honest, if you are born in Utah, it's probably the Mormon God. If you are born in Saudi Arabia, it's probably Allah. If you are born in India, it's one of the Hindu gods. Are most people examining a global field of options and carefully selecting the most evidence-based deity? Of course not. The courtroom in this analogy looks a lot more like inherited tradition, dressed up in post hoc rationalizations. So Ricky Gervais's question remains valid. If so many religions make competing claims, and their followers are also willing to suffer, die, and live morally meaningful lives, then how do we know your claims are true and theirs are not? Wes doesn't answer that. He just shifts the conversation to abstract philosophy and assumes the conclusion he's supposed to be defending.
When you read the New Testament with an historian's eye, do you see evidence of mythology creeping in where the basic tenets of Jesus of Nazareth and what happened to him and so on may well all be, to your eyes, verifiable historically, but that actually there may be mythology built up around that kind of character, and it's almost impossible to test that?
when we're looking at the particulars of Jesus's life, there are things that I just don't think you would make up. I mean, even the fact that Jesus comes from the city Nazareth, it's really the boonies, for lack of a better way of putting it, of Israel. People didn't expect Jesus to come from Nazareth. They didn't expect the Messiah to be a traveling itinerant rabbi. They expected in Jesus's day, with the cultural expectation of who the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one who was predicted by particularly individuals like the prophets in the Old Testament, they expected him to be a conqueror. They expected him to come and to release the nation of Israel from under the oppression of the Romans. They did not expect the Messiah to be murdered by the Romans.
Wes is really misrepresenting the issue here. When non-Christians or historians raise concerns about mythologizing in the Gospels, they are usually not pointing to the fact that Jesus came from Nazareth. In fact, most scholars agree that Jesus being from Nazareth is probably one of the most historically plausible details in the Gospel tradition, precisely because, as Wes says, it was an unexpected and unimpressive place. But that's not the part scholars see as mythological. The real concern is what the gospel writers do to work around that inconvenient fact. Everyone knew Jesus was from Nazareth, but they also believed he had to fulfill Micah's prophecy about being born in Bethlehem. So how do you resolve the tension? Each gospel comes up with its own theological solution. Luke invents a Roman census under Caesar Augustus, one that forced Joseph and Mary to travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem, while Mary was heavily pregnant, just in time for Jesus to be born there. Historians widely regard this census narrative as implausible and likely fabricated. There's no Roman record of such a census requiring people to return to their ancestral homes across long distances, let alone in a way that matches Luke's timeline. Matthew, on the other hand, flips the story. In his version, Joseph and Mary already live in Bethlehem. Jesus is born there, and it's only later, after fleeing Herod's massacre, that they move to Nazareth. That lets Matthew preserve the Bethlehem birth without explaining how they got there. So what do we see? Two conflicting stories trying to resolve the same theological problem. And this is exactly what historians mean by mythologizing. Not that everything is made up, but that legendary or symbolic elements are being layered on top of an earlier, simpler tradition to make it fit prophecy, expectation, or theology. In other words, it's not that Jesus of Nazareth is a myth. It's that Jesus of Nazareth, born in Bethlehem, in fulfillment of Scripture, has the fingerprints of literary construction all over it. Let's keep going.
I think in terms of what we as historians refer to as the criteria of embarrassment, women being the first eyewitnesses to the tomb in a day when women really weren't very good eyewitnesses for particular events. They weren't considered good eyewitness testimony. And we see kind of a trying to remedy that in later apocryphal documents like the Gospel of Peter. Gospel of Peter, which is written in, the subsequent centuries and has no real association with the Peter of history, tries to smooth over this by having Roman and Jewish officials being the first eyewitnesses to the tomb. Because whoever the author of that document was embarrassed by the fact that the historical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, have women as the first eyewitnesses to the tomb. So I think if we're asking the questions of mythological drift, I also think we need to account for the fact that there are details within the New Testament that would be embarrassing if they were made up. Why would you make up embarrassing facts about the closest disciples of Jesus, about the first eyewitnesses, and even about the kind of circumstances surrounding Jesus's life, unless those were actually things that actually did happen and they're trying to be honest with the information?
This claim that early Christians couldn't have made up a story with women as the first witnesses because it would have been too embarrassing doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Yes, it's true that in Jewish courts, women weren't accepted as legal witnesses, but that doesn't mean their voices carried no weight socially. In daily life, especially in close-knit religious communities, women were trusted within their circles. They talked, shared experiences and were believed by family, friends, and neighbors. So there's nothing inherently implausible about a story beginning with a woman at the tomb. In fact, it could have spread precisely because women told it and others found them trustworthy. Now, let's look at the claim that the Gospel of Peter tried to fix this alleged embarrassment. That theory doesn't make much sense. In that account, Jesus doesn't first appear to his male disciples. He appears to Roman soldiers and Jewish elders, the very people who condemned him. If embarrassment is the standard, wouldn't that be far worse? Why would a Christian author invent a version of the story where Jesus rises from the dead and reveals himself not to his faithful followers, but to his executioners? And more importantly, those witnesses don't even go out preaching, they stayed silent. If this was about boosting the credibility of the story with better witnesses, it fails spectacularly. What's ironic is that, according to the same apologetic logic, this version should be seen as more credible. Why would a Christian author invent such a narrative if it didn't actually happen, right? Yet I've never seen a Christian argue that the Gospel of Peter must be true because it includes hostile witnesses. Why not? Because they have already decided that the gospel truth is found only in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and anything that doesn't align is automatically dismissed. And here's something else that undermines the embarrassment argument. Paul's witness list in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Paul lists Peter, the 12, 500 brothers, James, and the apostles, but not a single woman. Not Mary Magdalene, not the other woman mentioned in the Gospels, not even as an afterthought. If women really were central to the earliest resurrection proclamation, why are they completely erased in Paul's earliest summary of the appearances? If omitting women is an indicator of fixing the record to match cultural expectations, wouldn't this be a more serious candidate than the Gospel of Peter? And if that undermines the credibility of the Gospel of Peter, then should we consider 1 Corinthians 15 unreliable in a similar manner? The truth is, this whole criterion of embarrassment line of reasoning assumes a very modern lens, where embarrassment equals authenticity. But ancient authors weren't just passively reporting facts, they shaped stories to teach theology, inspire faith, and give meaning to suffering. Embarrassment isn't a glitch in a story, it's often a rhetorical device. So the idea that no one would make up women as the first witnesses is just an apologetic talking point. It presumes embarrassment where there may have been none. And it ignores how real people process trust, belief, and storytelling. There's no reason a fictional resurrection narrative couldn't begin with a woman, unless you have already committed to believing the story is true and now need to reverse engineer a reason to justify that belief, which frankly is exactly what Wes Huff is doing here. If you have been following this whole series, you might have started to notice a pattern in Wes Huff's approach to apologetics. Time and again, he makes broad, confident claims that often sound persuasive at first, but don't hold up when you look closely. They are not grounded in careful historical analysis or scholarly consensus. Instead, they reflect a deeper goal, not to uncover the bare truth, but to defend a belief system. And that's really what apologetics is about. It's not neutral inquiry. It's a project of justification. That's why the information is often highly selective, and the framing is slanted to support a predetermined conclusion. I actually explored this further in another video titled Alex O'Connor Doesn't Understand Wes Huff, But You Can, where I explain why even well-educated Christian apologists like Wes Huff often makes basic factual errors in their arguments. If you are curious about how that happens and how to spot it, I've linked the video on the screen and in the description below. Now, I'm not saying this to discredit Wes personally, but it should serve as a reminder for all of us to stay mindful, not just of what Christian apologists say, but of everyone who's trying to sell you a worldview, defend a doctrine, or protect an identity. The real test isn't how confident someone sounds, but how fairly and critically they handle the evidence. That's the goal of this channel, not to tear down people, but to build up your thinking, so you are less likely to be misled by rhetoric dressed up as reason. If that sounds valuable to you, I invite you to subscribe so you won't miss future videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.